Good morning, operators. Welcome to the OVRLRD virtual training module. Today, we'll be learning the basics of Malkin's Training Scenario Creator. This tool is built into your OVRLRD simulation platform and will allow you to create and share missions with other pilots. It's still under development, so expect instability and back up your work if you care about it. First, open OVRLRD in non-VR mode and select Scenario Editor from the main menu. You can also just select it in VR and then remove your headset. Here we see the default screen. You'll notice that there's nothing around just yet, and the only way you can move the camera, no. So next, let's have a quick look at structures. This works quite similarly to NPCs. You just select place building, and you can choose from all of these different structures, say some post-Soviet buildings over here. While you're placing structures, you'll notice that holding down Shift snaps them to a grid. So that can help if you want to place them at regular intervals, say if you're creating a small town. This, and as always, the mouse wheel rotates them. You will notice it does need a little bit more work because if you raise and lower the terrain, the buildings will not move to match it. So you'll have to delete them and place them again, unfortunately. I think we can do. Yeah, let's bring it back. Okay, so there are basic roads here as well, which aren't as good as I would like them to be, but they're sort of good enough if you just want to direct the player somewhere. They also don't work super well with the terrain snapping, as you can see. So, you know, I can't delete them either. You know what, we'll come back to roads. This game is an early access. Stick that there, whatever. Okay, that'll do for buildings. Pretty basic. They're basically just obstacles and things you can smash around, smash into. They don't serve much of a purpose yet. Yeah, these are locked out because they're not implemented yet. Okay, so that's buildings. This is the editor. This is a 3D viewport through which you can view your mission. To look around, hold down the middle mouse button and drag your view. This is to free up the other mouse buttons for selecting and editing objects. You can always find information in the help section here. You'll notice it's quite ugly and it's a work in progress, but it's useful to have a quick reference just to let you know how the flow of mission design should work. I need to fix this. So the first thing I want to do is open up the terrain menu and generate a basic terrain that you can start working with. The resolution slider determines how detailed your terrain will be. Higher values will hit performance and memory and will take longer to generate. Lower values will be a little bit sort of smoother and bumpier, which sometimes you might want. So let's leave it at 3 for now. The terrain size is the size of the grid the terrain will exist on. At the moment, it's limited to 14 by 14, which is about 14 by 14 kilometers plus some in game. So you usually won't need it to be this high. Most missions will be fine between 3 and 4. So let's generate 4 by 4. This drop down, which the label appears to be missing, this drop down selects the mood of your terrain. So this basically determines the texture and material that is applied to the ground. For most things, you will want plains, low altitude. Low altitude just determines that the shader will account for the fact that the terrain isn't very high up. So it will change at what height the textures change from grass to slopes to rocks and that sort of thing. This one here, this drop down determines the algorithm parameters that are used to generate the terrain. So let's start off with gentle, just to show you how it works. Okay, and you'll notice it's generated a fairly boring sort of flat and lumpy terrain for us, which we can use as a base. It will always generate in this sort of island format where it uses a fall-off map to bring the height of the terrain down at the edges to make sure that it never sort of disappears into thin air. But if you take the size down to 1, which I don't recommend, it will give you sort of just a chunk without a fall-off map in use. I'm not sure how useful this is at the moment, but you are able to find these meshes once you save it in the folder. So if you want to export them or import them into Unity and muck around with them, that's something that you can do. So let's bring it back to 4 and let's look at some of the other modes. Dramatic. This tends to be a little bit more lumpy than gentle. You will notice slightly different results from the generator depending on the resolution you have it set up. So I think for dramatic, a higher resolution tends to give you a bit more of these sort of, it's like peaks and valleys. If we go to bumpy, we'll see it creates more sort of trenches. By tweaking the height curve, it creates these sort of dips and these flatter areas up here, which can be good for missions which have a bit more verticality to them. And you'll notice that if we change the terrain material before we generate, we'll get a different look. So this is Rockies. We have desert, which is quite similar to that. Just countryside. And you'll notice the difference between plains and plains low altitude is plains, you will not get the green areas except at the higher elevations. So if you want to have a map that's got quite dramatic differences in height, you will want to choose between these quite carefully. Valleys is kind of a strange one. Valleys has a sort of big flat floodplains at the bottom and flatter places on top. So it's a little bit similar to bumpy, but it tends to put a bit more of an emphasis on these high up areas and less sharp changes in elevation, more sort of gradual ones after a good amount of terrain has been passed over. And then you've got flat if you just don't want the machine to do anything for you. So let's do bumpy. Let's close that and let's save our progress, which you'll want to do frequently. You want to give your scenario a unique ID, so let's call it tutorial and save the scenario. Saved. You'll notice in the save load menu, you can also load scenarios and you can open the custom scenarios folder, which will open the data folder where all of these things are stored. So if you want to back up your work, that's where you want to go. We will cover these another time, but this is the workshop functionality that is pretty bare bones at the moment, but you can upload items to the OVRLRD Steam Workshop, and refreshing them loads in scenarios that you have subscribed to, so you can then load them in the editor and see how they work. If you want to play these custom scenarios, you do that through the scenarios menu in the main menu. You don't need to come in here if you just want to play custom scenarios. Right. So let's very quickly look over the terrain editing tools. If you open up terrain, you'll see you've got raise and lower, level, and paint objects. So they're pretty simple. With raise lower, you simply use the mouse wheel to set the size of the radius that you're affecting, and left click raises things, right click lowers things. And you'll notice that the terrain shader is sort of adapting to the height as you do so. You can do this across chunk boundaries quite smoothly, so you don't really need to worry about that. These lines here, these seams you can see are a lighting error that I need to fix, but they won't be very noticeable in game. So don't worry, that's not your fault, that's my fault. Level terrain is slightly different. You right click to sample the height of the point you're looking at. You'll see this indicator shows you how different it is to where you're currently looking. So say you want to bring this whole area up to this height, you'll right click here and then click and drag, and it will bring it all up to the same height. And you'll notice this terrain material has a different texture that it applies to totally flat areas. So if you want to get rid of that, just give it a little bit of natural bumpiness. Sort of ease that off. There you go. With paint objects, you can use this to paint details onto the terrain. You can use quite a lot of them. OVRLRD is quite performant when it comes to this sort of thing. I'm not sure what's happened here. So don't put tens of thousands of trees, but and these need better names as well. But these are all trees. These are rocks, and this is grass. Don't put tens of thousands, but you can put a fair few for texture and to sort of block off sight lines, and it should be able to handle it pretty well. So just select it, set your radius, left click to place, right click to delete. So if you want to create sort of interesting shapes of tree lines, I recommend just putting a whole lot down and then using the delete tool to sort of carve out shapes like this. And you've got a nice little clearing. We can use a couple different kinds of trees just for color. These will all be physically simulated. You don't need to do anything special. The player can just stomp through them and it will work as expected. Are these different trees? Yeah, they're different trees. When you right click to clear, it will only clear instances of the brush that you have currently selected. Let's put some rocks in. You can't click and drag with the rocks because I figured that they were probably a bit more, you only want to place like a couple at a time, but these can give your slopes a little bit more character. I mean, it's very, I'm not very good at designing level. I just write the code, so I'll leave the artistry of it to you. And the grass, this is more of a sort of experimental thing, but you can place down a lot of grass objects and it doesn't really hurt performance that much, but it also doesn't look that great except in certain circumstances. So I wouldn't recommend covering large areas with it, but what it can be useful for is feathering the edges of sort of hills to give it a bit more of a sort of feathery textured look when you're approaching them. But again, it's more of an experiment. I'd like to come back to this in future, maybe make the grass a bit bigger, a bit more interesting, but for the moment it's mainly there as a fun little trick. Okay, so that's basically how the terrain tools work. So, triggers. These are areas where if the player moves into them, it fires a scripted event. So these are useful for all sorts of reasons. So let's say maybe you're creating a stealth mission, and if the player enters a certain area, you send helicopters to attack them, for example. So let's maybe just put an example here. You can use the mouse wheel to change the size of the trigger. So let's make it quite big. So just if the player enters this area, it will do something. If you select it, you can see it's got a name. It's not particularly useful in the Spectre at the moment, but it now appears in the triggers menu. So you can rename the IDs of triggers. I think it should be fine, but there's no real reason to, so I would probably leave them for now. So you actually have several types of triggers. Player enter trigger is probably the one you'll use the most, but you also have timestamp elapsed, which means it will fire after this number of seconds have passed. So we've got other system, which is internal. I use that in the code. You won't be able to do anything with that. Game objects inactive means it will trigger if all of the relevant game objects have been deactivated, which for NPCs means they've been destroyed. So you could, for example, have this trigger fire its scripted events or activate its objectives if, for example, all of these tanks are destroyed, if you just selected them all in the elements menu. There are other ways to achieve that same effect, e.g. with objectives, but this just gives you a bit of extra flexibility. Something enter trigger is also, that should work actually. So something enter trigger is similar to player enter trigger, but you can select an object, and if that object enters the trigger, it will then fire. I'm not sure how effective this is, but for example, you could, so if you try to select something and nothing happens, it means that that is not implemented yet. So actually, I think something enter trigger is not yet functional. So apologies for that. Unit tagged. Let's see. I think some of these actually might need some extra logic. So maybe just ignore all of these for now. But timestamp elapsed, player enter trigger, and I think player fired weapon and missile launched, they should all work. So let's leave it on player enter trigger for now, and I will go back and fix those bugs as soon as I can. Mission time trigger, this I think will work as a fallback for any of this. So if the player hasn't entered the trigger after say 30 seconds, this trigger will fire. Delay on fire means once they've walked into the trigger, say 5 seconds will pass and then it will do its thing. So you can link scripted events. We haven't got any scripted events yet. And you can link objectives. The linked objectives. This also looks like it's not working. I'm going to go back to the triggers menu and make sure it's working. But once it's, oh no, it is working. Sorry. So that is the objective that it will activate when you enter the trigger. So we could have it so that if this tower is destroyed, it activates the extract objective. But also, if you move into this trigger, it will also activate the extract objective. So yeah, let's leave it like that. And yeah, well, that's basically how triggers work. We'll also take off the delay on fire. Okay. Next, let's have a quick look at the scenario tools. These are quite basic, but it basically just sort of lets you set the time of day, the time of year, and the weather conditions. It works pretty much as you would expect. The time of year sets the sort of angle of the sun in the sky. Time of day. The time of day will progress through a mission, not very quickly, so you won't notice it, but just bear in mind that if you start a mission like this, after a few minutes, it will start to get a little bit brighter, and you'll see sort of a nice sunrise effect, if that's even working at the moment. So it's set to early morning in winter. Weather conditions, foggy obviously creates fog. Snow, so if you want snow, you should select the snow material first when you're generating your terrain. Unfortunately, you can't select snow and see it in editor after you've already generated the terrain, but I think it will apply the snow material when you spawn it in a mission, which is a bit of a confusing flow, something I need to work on. Rain is kind of similar. It doesn't affect the terrain, but it creates fog, and rain and snow will both create rain and snow effects that will follow the player around, so you don't need to place them manually. And dust storm is quite similar. It creates fog, and it also creates a dust storm effect that follows the player around. So let's just leave on clear for now. Next up, we need to place our player. So that's under units, place a player, and you just choose the player's starting position. So let's put them up here. You can use the mouse wheel to rotate objects as you're placing them, and left click places them. And you can place them again just to move them around. So let's stick them there. And NPCs is the next thing. So I want to put some infantry down here and then a couple of tanks over here. So select NPC infantry squad. I'll just rotate them and just place them wherever. So going here, another one here, another one here. And right click to cancel unit placement. Once you've placed a unit, you can select it and view details about it in the inspector. This is quite limited at the moment, but what you can do is you can change the allegiance of it. So I'm going to leave them as enemy. You can change their default behavior. For the moment, let's leave that. That's a bit more in-depth, and infantry doesn't work quite the same as other NPCs. And you can also choose whether the unit is asleep or airborne. Obviously, don't make a infantry airborne because that won't work very well. And asleep is mostly for mechs or helicopters who you want to activate given some certain trigger. And you can also delete the entities there. We didn't actually want to delete them though, so with Control Z, we can undo that and bring them back. And with Control Y, delete them again. So the undo redo is pretty stable. It should work reasonably well at this point, but it doesn't account for all actions yet. So sort of if I change this to friendly, undoing it won't actually account for that. So just bear in mind it's mostly for if you accidentally place or delete something. So that's infantry, and now let's place some tanks over here somewhere. It's down here, it's fine. So again, Overlord is quite performant. You can place a lot of units. Try not to go too crazy with it, but up to about 100 and 150 enemies, you should mostly be fine. You'll see serious performance degradation after that, depending on the kind of units you place. So just keep that in mind. And you can also place certain mechs. Not all of the available mech chassis will be immediately available in the editor. They need a little bit of extra work, but you can currently place an Albatross, a Blackbird, or a Starling. So we'll put another, maybe a friendly Blackbird down here. And we'll set him to friendly and set his behavior to, let's just leave it as idle because they will automatically change their behavior when they see what's going on. So he's going to see some enemy infantry, and he's probably going to go nuts on them. Right, and these are all enemy. Okay, great. So I mean, that's basically all you need for a simple mission. Just place units, edit your terrain, and place the player, and you will be able to hop in and muck around. Like, there's no objectives, there's no events or anything, so you'll need to exit the mission manually when you're finished. But this is enough to hop in and have fun. Now let's go on to the meat and potatoes of the OVRLRD mission editor, which is logic. Now, you don't need logic in your missions. They should just work. But if you want to give them a little bit of narrative or make them just more interesting or challenging to play, this is where you start. So, objectives. First things first, we want to create an objective so that people can actually win our mission. So I think, let's have a simple one. Destroy all enemies. Just adding this will be enough to give your mission a win condition. So let's give it an ID. Destroy all. And this is a bit of an annoying flow. I apologize. You have to click on the objective to make the ID update. It'll be fine if you close out of it, but I don't like to see things out of sync. So active on start means that this objective will be active from the moment we start the mission. It means we don't have to activate it later with a scripted event. The description is what appears in the objective screen when the player looks at it. So let's put kill them. The timeout gives the mission a time limit. So let's say you have to defeat them all in 5 minutes. And if you complete the objective, the mission is complete. And if you fail the objective, the mission is failed. That's what these two mean. So with destroy all enemies, you don't need to add any relevant objects or anything like that. It should just work. But let's add another one. Let's add maybe an optional objective. Let's say we also want the player to defend structure. So this one does require a relevant object. Let's say that if this tower is destroyed, then the mission has failed. So this we click add, and we select it from this list here. Structure tower. This again is not a great UI. Like you can, for example, select incompatible objects like a tank or infantry. So just try and behave. So structure tower and critical failure. Say defend the tower. Yeah. The ID. Now we have 2 objectives. So this is a great chance to save our game. Oof. Okay, so we have our objectives now. Probably this is a good opportunity to hop in and test the game. So we click test. We don't put our headset on. To keep things quick, to test in the editor, you'll need to use the non-VR mode. But if you do want to test your scenario in VR mode, because it's saved, you can exit from the editor and then load it as a custom scenario and test it that way. But this is just faster, so let's do this. It will load the mission, and it will take a little while because it's a custom scenario, so it has to bake the nav mesh when you load in. Jesus, that's loud. Okay, we haven't designed this as a particularly friendly mission, but you'll notice that our friend down here has indeed gone ham on these infantry while we were booting up. But you see, we're just in here already. All our stuff is here. We've got our defend objective over here shown up properly, and we should see some tanks down here. Assuming that hasn't been a horrible mistake. I don't see any tanks, do you? Well, let's have a look at our objective screen. Okay, so the objectives are here. It looks like there's been a problem with the tanks. I wonder if I accidentally deleted them. So yeah. Oh. Nope. They just went hiding. Oh, a little bit of friendly fire there. Anyway, so when you're done testing your mission, press escape, quit mission. And then unfortunately you will have to load into the scenario editor again. And then save load scenario, tutorial. And all our stuff is here. So I guess what happened is these tanks immediately knew that this guy was here because the infantry saw it and reported his position. So they immediately tried to move and engage him. Unfortunately, because this is such a steep slope, the tanks weren't able to reach. And because they were aiming up at such a high angle, they actually couldn't open fire on the mech as it was moving down. So these are the kind of things you have to keep in mind when you're designing missions. Because it's a simulation, I don't add a lot of arbitrary rules to ensure that things can always be fair. So you will often find that you've designed a scenario where one force is not able to engage properly. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're testing. You'll have to alter the parameters to make sure that you get the kind of experience that you want. So you don't need to rebake the nav mesh or anything like that. When you make changes, it'll all be done quite quickly on start. So that should be a shallow enough slope for these tanks to get up, but who knows? Yeah. Right, so this all seems to be working reasonably well. Let's go over very quickly some of the other logical things you can do. So these tools will mostly be quite familiar to you if you've used a mission editor before, but some of them are a little bit specific. So I'll go over all of them just quickly so you have an idea of what they do. So objectives, they can be linked to scripted events or to other objectives. This means that if you link one objective to another, completing one of these objectives can then reveal the other objective or activate it. A linked scripted event might mean that you fire a scripted event when the objective is successful or when the objective is failed. So you can add them using this menu. And you can similarly activate an objective whether one objective is successful or failed. So for example, I might make it so that defend tower isn't a critical failure, but if it fails, you have another objective, which is extract, and you have to move to a point. So we untick active on start. We do critical success because when we get to the extraction point, we want to end the mission. And for this, we want to link, activate on failure, extract. So now, if the player fails defend tower, extract will be activated and it will tell them to move to a point, which we haven't created yet. So points are literally just points in space. They don't appear in game unless they're relevant to an objective, but you can place them to mark a particular position that is important. So let's say the extraction point is over here, point 0. So you can't, for various technical reasons, you can't sort of rename elements yet because their names are used as the unique IDs for saving and loading. I might come back and try and fix that at some point, and for some reason points have allegiances, which doesn't make any sense. So apologies for that, but it does work. So now in logic, we can go to our objective screen, go to extract, add point. So now it will pop up a little marker in the HUD saying that you have to move here as your objective when the extract objective is activated. So I hope that made sense. On to triggers. So scripted events. Scripted events are basically glue that exists between triggers and objectives and effectors. So let's actually very briefly talk about what effectors are. Effectors are objects that when they're fired, they cause something to happen in the world. So they direct an NPC or they create an object or something like that. And scripted events are events that occur. So a trigger might set off a scripted event, and that scripted event will then fire a trigger, fire an effector, or it will activate an objective, for example. So let's call this event player moved forward. And we're going to link it to this trigger. So now when the player enters this trigger, it will activate that objective and it will also fire this scripted event. And scripted events can be used to, for example, display a message in the player's helmet or enable objects. That's for effectors or an empty notification. But actually, these three options more or less do the same thing at the moment, because if these fields are filled out, the scripted event will use them. So just leave it on display message, and you don't have to put a message here. But let's say extract. Oh, helmet header extracts. Message can be go to points now, and the message will last 3 seconds. And it will also, well, we haven't got any effectors yet. Let's leave that there. But we now have a scripted event where when it's fired, we'll display this message. And currently, this event will be fired if the player moves into this area. Let's create an effector. You know what? First of all, let's create a helicopter. Okay, helicopters will always spawn in the air unless you select them and unselect airborne rather. I think let's leave it as airborne. Actually, let's just create it a bit further away. Over here, looking that way. Should create 3 of them. We've got 3 helicopters now. And I'm going to create an effector. I'm going to call it send helis. And the effector type will be alert to player. So these all should work. They do various things. Activate simply means that an NPC that is asleep will become awake and will start responding to things. Move to point. You can, for example, let's add all the helicopters so we've got them. Add actor means you can select an NPC for this to affect. So we're targeting the helicopters. And add target, we could, for example, add the point and move to point. When this effector is fired, it will cause all of these helicopters to move to this point over here. So we could do that. We could do follow route, which you would select, rather than a point, you would select a route, which I'll cover in a bit. But a route is basically a series of points. And when you specify this, the NPCs will then follow that route. But of course, if they come across an enemy while they're following that route, they'll defer following the route and they'll go and attack it, for example. So this is another thing you need to be aware of. The NPCs have their own free will, and it's you won't always be able to override that unless you're very careful about it. Start patrol is similar to follow route, but they will follow the route in a circuit and keep doing it until they notice something amiss. Attack point means they will attack that point until told to do something else. So that's useful if you want them to continually attack a building like this one. But they won't be aware that the thing that they're attacking has been destroyed. So you'll need to manually tell them to do something else if you give them this order. Alert to player simply means that they will become aware of the player's existence wherever they are, which means they will, in most cases, that means they will move to the player and attack them. And become tagged means that no matter how far away a unit is, it will be marked in the player's heads-up display, and they will be aware that that unit exists. So that's used in a campaign mission, search and destroy, to when the radar jammer is destroyed, it fires an effector that tags all of the units in the area. That's just an example of how you can use these tools to create a narrative. So for this, we're actually going to alert the helis to the player, because that will cause them to move and attack it. Yep, so that's an effector. Just remember that the actors are the things that are being told to do something, and targets are objects that are relevant to the task they're being given. So now that we have an effector, we can connect it to our scripted event, which means that now when the player moves into this area, it will trigger these helicopters to come and attack him, and he will be told to extract to that point there. And I will just very quickly show you how routes work. So defining route, we're not going to use this, but we're just going to place it. Click, 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 right click. There you go. Right click finalizes the route, left click creates the route. So delete routes, undo deletion. You can't undo route creation, which is another thing I need to fix. But the other thing you can do with routes is you can control click to delete the last point on the route. Boop. Right click. There you go. Now we've got a circuit, so we could tell someone to patrol that if we wanted. Oh, you know what? Just for fun, let's place a Jeep. Bonk. And let's tell that Jeep. I don't think that will work. I think we need an effector for it. So logic, effectors, create racetrack. Effector, follow route. That shouldn't be rendering on top of that menu. Actor, Jeep, target, route 1. So you should. Oh wait, no, we want patrol because we want it to circle the route. And we will want a scripted event. Start race. Doesn't really matter, does it? What it's put. No logic's just fun. Mission time trigger after 1 second. It will start the racetrack effector. So we've got a scripted event that starts itself after 1 second. It sets off an effector. The effector tells the actor Jeep 5 to start patrol on target route 1. And that's all you need. So I think we've actually got a working mission now. Fingers crossed. So I'm going to save it. I should have been saving as I went along. And if I click test, what should happen is a number of things.
Fucking hell, I see them! Reactor online. Sensors.
So our friendly mech is attacking. Our friendly mech is attacking this infantry. And I believe the tanks are aware of him, so they're now moving in to engage. I need to turn on my weapons. And because I've tagged them, the mech is aware of them. So, but they are in fact not able to move up that slope. It's too steep. Jesus. Okay, so I'm going to leave them to do it. You'll notice we can just about probably see the helicopters over there, but they're well out of range. So if I enter this trigger, it should doesn't appear to have set off the. Doesn't seem to have set off the effector. Well, that's okay. We'll need to investigate why that isn't working. Probably it's a bug. But you should also see. Okay, the Jeep is racing around down here, having a grand old time. Okay, that I think just about does it for the scenario editor. Yeah, I'm going to log off now, and I'm going to investigate why that didn't work. I have a feeling it wasn't the problem with our logic. Let me just only selected one thing. Yeah, I think this is a bug in the editor rather than a bug with our mission. But I think probably if we made it move to point and told them to move to that point, it would work better. I'm sure why 2 of those are disappeared. Oh, I know. It's because when I was trying to undo this route here, I must have accidentally undone these helicopters over here. So that is user error. But on the whole, it should work. If you do run into any issues with the... So I deleted that. Yeah, so there are bugs. If you run into any issues with the scenario editor, please let me know in Discord. It's a very, very early version, but I wanted to get it out so that people could play around with it and get an idea of the depth of things you can create with this. And yeah, I will keep working on this and improve it in future, but I need feedback and bug reports to make that happen. So, thank you for watching. I don't like video tutorials, but I thought it was probably necessary for this sort of thing. So I hope you found this bearable. If you watched it on 1.5 speed, that's fine too. And yeah, have fun, make missions, save your work, and please don't get too mad at me if you lose your data. Okay, bye.